Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 9th of December, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Boris Johnson apologising for his handling of the pandemic whilst being interrupted by protesters at the COVID inquiry, Israel intensifying its assault on southern Gaza, and the death of British poet Benjamin Zephaniah, aged 65. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Julia O'Driscoll from The Week magazine, its assistant editor Leaf Arbuthnot, and we have books reviews editor for the International Affairs Journal, Mariana Vieira. And Mariana, you're kicking us off this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Can the race in space lead to war on Earth?
They're ruthless. They'll shoot you, kill you, or send you to a labor camp. Last year, they publicly executed a 22-year-old man for listening to South Korean songs and sharing them with his friends. They said they were punishing him harshly to set the right precedent. Everyone is afraid.
A North Korean defector who pulled off the seemingly impossible by crossing into South Korea, talking to BBC News in a story published on Wednesday about life in that part of the world at the moment, Mariana. What's been happening this week?
So a lot has been happening. On Monday, South Korea successfully conducted a flight of a solid fuel rocket carrying a satellite over the sea near the Jeju Island. This has taken place amid a growing space race with neighboring North Korea. So although the satellite will be used for civilian purposes, the Defense Ministry in South Korea said that the successful launch will enable the country to accelerate its surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities.
And SpaceX were involved as well, right?
So actually, no, this is where the plot thickens because SpaceX helped South Korea send a different satellite to space on Friday. So they sent their first spy satellite into orbit. From the United States, from California's Vandenberg Space Force Base. And this, too, was also a response to North Korea's satellite launch in late November.
Okay, and just briefly before I bring this out to everyone else then, what were North Korea doing launching satellites in November? And why was there uproar about that, given that South Korea do have satellites up there too?
So developing a functioning spy satellite is one of North Korea's major goals in their 5-year military plan. They had tried twice before. They were failed. So this is the first successful one that they've launched. The question is that it breaches international sanctions that were placed on North Korea in 2006. And it also goes against the military pact that North Korea has with South Korea, which was signed in 2018.
Yes. So, Leaf, it means basically that military pact that was signed in 2018, that maybe those of us with our eye off the ball hadn't noticed had elapsed, has now basically been broken. The North Koreans are ignoring it.
Yeah, and it was not very popular with some of South Koreans either, both politicians and the military. So this story for me is a bit of a temperature check on the North Korea South Korea situation, and it would indicate that it's not great because obviously it's a game of one-upmanship where South Korea wants to show that it's much stronger and more threatening than its neighbor. But the satellite that South Korea launched on Friday, the SpaceX satellite, which obviously is a Musk-run organization, it's apparently capable of seeing objects that are just 30 centimeters long, which I found pretty impressive. And in my reading around the story, I've found that there have been some questions about whether North Korea's space satellite, which it did launch, after 2 failed attempts, is actually any good at all.
Yeah, I mean, you look at a lot of the military hardware that North Korea unveil, because they do these big sort of photo shoots, don't they, with Kim all dressed up in his gear and everything. And actually, often it's repurposed stuff from like the 70s. It doesn't appear to be particularly cutting edge. Julia?
Yeah, that's very true. North Korea does have huge stockpiles of Soviet-era ammunition, and so it's not hugely surprising that that's the case. But the key thing is basically that it can't be verified by Western intelligence sources. So North Korea claims that the satellite that it launched has so far managed to capture pictures of the White House, Pentagon, the US and British warships and military bases in South Korea and Japan in that region. But that hasn't yet been verified, and whether or not it's capable of doing so very much remains up in the air.
But the North Koreans, Mariana, are talking tough as well as acting tough.
Yeah, so that's right. North Korea's state media has warned that physical clash and war have become a matter of time. They've said this specifically in response to any potential retaliation from the US. If they were to strike down their satellite, this is how they would be responding. But also they've been progressing towards armed conflict a lot throughout the year. So you can see this clear trend of Kim Jong-un dismissing his top generals. And in August, they've had this meeting to expand the military and combat capabilities. And they, once again, staged this sort of photo of the generals looking at a map that looked a bit blurred, but it was very, very specifically or very clearly the map of Seoul, South Korea's capital. And they have also test-fired more than 100 missiles since the start of the year. They've prompted Seoul to reinstate their national-wide civil defense drills. So essentially, I think in a way it looks like North Korea is preparing for war, but also South Korea is taking that preparation quite seriously. And so are the other players in the region, such as Japan, who is now meeting with China for the first time in 4 years.
Should they be taking it so seriously, Leaf? Should we take this warning from Pyeongchang more seriously than others in the past? We have been here before.
We have. I mean, my position on this is that I find it emotionally quite difficult to, feel scared by this situation. But, maybe like a week of escalations and then suddenly there's a sort of nuclear conflagration. And so I think we probably should take it more seriously than I emotionally find it able to do.
Is that unwillingness to kind of bond with the fear of it, if you like, because we've seen it so many times before and because it's so obviously propaganda?
I think it's a combination of the fact that we've seen it lots of times before, and there's something, and this is one of the tragedies of our time, which is that North Korea is a country that's economy is in dire shape. Its people are in poverty, are brainwashed, are many of them dying of starvation, and we don't know the half of it, basically. And so taking it seriously as a proper threat on the global stage is something that I find difficult to do, because they just don't seem like a credible fighting force, particularly as a country.
Well, I mean, this is it behind the scenes, Julia. However many troops they've got, they're out there ready to fight for the great leader. As we heard from that defector in the clip, their people are starving. You do wonder, if they made an initial assault, then what?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, then what? I think what is really important to underline here is that North Korea is one of the most unpredictable international foreign agents in the world. And so to know what that could look like or what kind of war plan North Korea might pursue is just a total unknown. And I think there's almost, when it comes to kind of Western approaches to this, there is a real issue with trying to impose like a Western philosophy or prediction or expectation of how a country might react. And it's just not possible in the case of North Korea. I think it's also, just to come back to the technology point that you mentioned earlier, there clearly have been advances behind the scenes. There was the meeting between Putin and Kim in September, and the whole focus of that talk was about space technology. So the fact that these launches have then successfully happened not very long after shows that, advances are being made, but also that relationship with Russia is going to become really important, not only in terms of technological advancement, but also in terms of power and influence on the global stage.
Yeah, what is their current relationship like, Mariana, with Russia and I guess with China? Because without that, it is less significant.
I think that's so interesting because it's really hard to know. So even from the summit that Julia was mentioning, no one really knows what they talked about exactly or what the outcomes were. And there's just a lot of suspicion about whether North Korea is sending armaments to help Russia fight the war in Ukraine. It definitely looks like they've gotten closer. This was between Putin and Kim. This was North Korea's first state visit after the country completely shut off its borders in the beginning of the pandemic, which also would make sense because there's not many other places that they would visit, I would presume. It's also a test of how the West responds to the potential of a closer alliance. So, and the development of these weapons and this technology, whatever the response is from the US and its allies, shows other countries what they would be able to do, who they would be able to ally to, what sort of tolerance there is for appeasement in that sense.
Leaf.
So the war in Ukraine, I think, has been pretty good for North Korea. In October, the US published images that it claimed showed hundreds of containers of military equipment and munitions being transported from North Korea to Russia. So in a way, the fact that North Korea is supplying arms seemingly to Russia is probably, finally some good news for the economy, which was so strangled, particularly during the pandemic. And one other thing to say is that we heard a clip at the beginning of a defector who had made it out of North Korea. Over the years, it's become much harder to escape North Korea. China has apparently put up sort of more kind of protections for the country because it's obviously had a long relationship with North Korea. And Kim has been a little bit harder on defectors than his father. So that's just something to bear in mind when you do hear of defections. They are increasingly amazing because it's so hard to get out of the country.
I mean, Mariana, we've said already how unpredictable this region is, but if I was going to push you to predict what might happen next and why this week was an important week, what would your answer be?
That is a very interesting question. I think questions surrounding uncertainty with North Korea are just so impossible to answer. I mean, this has made all the headlines and we haven't even been able to confirm whether the satellite is actually taking any pictures at this point. And so it does feel like obfuscation and this sort of propaganda are their main tools on their menu, which makes it harder to predict how it's going. I did see in the news today that China had forcefully deported 600 defectors back to North Korea, whom we have no idea what happened to. So the relationship between the two is also apparently one of increasing cooperation. It's just really hard to tell, but North Korea coming closer with Russia and or China does mean that US allies are also coming closer. As I briefly mentioned, as soon as there were news about the satellite, Japan, China, and South Korea got together in a meeting for the first time in a few years.
Okay. Leaf, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Leaf, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Could your porn be watching you?
What kids say sometimes is that they were confused, they were grossed out. I've seen some children say, but actually also some of them actually feel really guilty.
Yes.
And they don't ask anybody about it. And then they can get addicted. And by then they're into a really difficult spiral. So we have to do something about this.
Ofcom Chief Executive Dame Melanie Dawes talking to Vanessa Feltz on Talk TV on Wednesday. Leaf, what was she talking about and what's happened this week?
So Ofcom, which is the UK's media regulator, is tasked with enforcing something called the Online Safety Act. And it's unveiled this week what's called sort of age verification measures. It is saying that porn sites will have to ensure that their users are over 18 when they actually go on these websites. And people are stressing out about it because of the idea that by handing over their private information to porn websites, which aren't considered necessarily the world's most trusty guardians of information, they will put themselves in danger.
I mean, the information they'd be handing over is a photo of their face in this scenario, right? So they'd take a selfie and then it would determine whether they were under 18. It wouldn't know who they were, what their name was. It would know their IP address.
Well, so there's a kind of several options that Ofcom is putting forward, suggesting that porn websites can use to, as it's called, age gate their services. So one of them is a facial scan. which might determine that you are under 25, and then ask for further verification. But there are other options being put forward by Ofcom, such as, a link to your banking website. So you'd get your credit card company, say, to confirm that you are over 18. So I think that there's been some sort of, not misreporting, but people are focusing on the facial recognition aspect when actually there are other things that are part of this age verification program, which is still under consultation, by the way. And these rules haven't been introduced, and they will probably be introduced in 2025. So we've got a long time to wait for these rules to come in.
I mean, the thing is, Julia, it's very hard to find people who say still we should have a totally open internet and children should be able to access pornography. No one really respectable is saying that. So then it's a question about, well, how do you do it? And this doesn't seem like a completely unreasonable idea, does it? If it is encrypted and if, as Leaf said, you could use, for example, a banking app that just, it's basically the porn site would ask my bank, am I over 18? Yes or no? That's the only information they'd have from me. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, my general feeling when I was reading about this is that it is a really good solution, and it sounds like it could be very effective. The safety concerns, we basically need more information about the safety aspect of this, and also that I assume that will vary depending on which sites decide to take up which different options are available to them. So communicating that really transparently is going to be really key. But I was also reading that as this is kind of an emerging technology and it's obviously being worked on all the time, there are different ways that it can work. And one thing is that basically whether or not you are re-recognized when you then log on to a website for the second time, or whether each time it just scans your face. And if that's the case, then it won't have stored any of that biometric data. So any kind of leak or hack, it wouldn't be your image wouldn't be released as part of that. So there are definitely so many questions around it. But in general, I was pretty impressed by this.
I mean, I suppose it kind of comes down to, Mariana, how embarrassing a hack it would be anyway. If, it was publicly available, these are the faces of the people that have accessed legal pornography as grown-ups. I mean, is that a particularly defaming thing to have said about you these days?
Well, I suppose it's. I think it might be a bit more than that. I was reading about how the age verification technologies can. So the risk for the sensitive personal data being breached, collected, shared, or sold does depend on other factors as well. So the potential consequences can vary depending on whether you're someone who has a high profile, who has a certain reputation to maintain. So the consequences can include blackmail, fraud. They can bring some relationship damage on. I mean, whether you are a high profile person or not. But also, I hadn't thought about this, but it could include outing people's sexual preferences, and especially for people who are in vulnerable circumstances. And so there are things that we might not consider because they don't personally affect us. But I think, like Leaf was saying, the fact that it's a consultation is quite good because they're still considering the different options, and they're taking some of this discussion on board. And the fact that it is intrusive is highlighted by the notion that this is making the news, whereas other measures to tackle websites or underage access to websites on suicide and terrorism are generally more accepted by society. So there's something definitely there to be talked about.
I suppose it's a balance, isn't it, Leaf? Mariana's outlined some of the potential harms to adults that could come, but you have to weigh it up against the harms that we know about to children. So I suppose let's spell those out. What are those?
Yeah, well, so there's a lot of evidence that that porn leads to sexual practices that would be considered extreme in some cases. So, for instance, there's been a rise in strangling during sex, which is quite common in porn. And Billie Eilish, I note, she famously spoke out about the fact that she'd had an addiction to watching porn, which started at the age of 11, and that it gave her nightmares and that it kind of messed her up when she started dating. And she's called porn a disgrace, and that she used to watch a lot of porn. The needs of children.
Some people would say, is that something that you could counter with education, though? Because if it's legal and we're saying adults can watch porn where people, simulate strangling each other, but it's more damaging somehow if you're under 18, then you need to teach under 18-year-olds what they're looking at, don't you? Because it's kind of damaging for everybody. Why do adults have the context but children don't?
No, I mean, I disagree with that. I think that children are known to be much more porous and vulnerable. They're developing when they're under 18. And actually, they're developing up, men are developing up to the age of sort of 25, their brains. So I do think there is a really strong argument for not just educating people that, you might see someone, on a website sort of anally having sex with a woman that doesn't seem to be enjoying it. I don't think it's enough to educate people about that stuff. I think they have to actually be stopped from watching it. Just as we try to stop kids from watching really, really violent films. I know that, I was much more vulnerable to extreme imagery when I was young than I am now. I remember I once, when I was at school, we all gathered round to watch King Kong, my friend's laptop, and it turned out to be extremely explicit porn. And it's stayed with me in the way that, porn that I've seen later in life has not stayed with me. So I'm very pro actually prioritizing the needs of children over the needs of adults. And if adults have to have a more irritating time, having to scan their faces, get out their passports, get out their credit cards, I think that's a sacrifice we should be collectively willing to make.
I mean, also, you're never going to catch the chairman of Ofcom saying this, Julia, but the truth is a determined 16 or 17-year-old who, works out how to use a VPN or how to scan their dad's passport or whatever so that they can pleasure themselves. That is a different case scenario to an 11-year-old stumbling across it on Safe Search Off, isn't it? I mean, that's the point. We're talking about children, it's a huge category. We're not really talking about determined teenagers. We're talking about the accidental exposure to indecent images of children.
Yeah, absolutely. There were some really shocking statistics that I read around this topic. So the Children's Commissioner, who's been looking into this for the Online Safety Commission, found that kids first see porn on average at the age of 13, which is just so young. And it is that context, as Leaf was saying, when it's in schools and it's friends mucking around and this kind of very young normalization of this quite like horrific and distressing content potentially. One thing that I thought also is quite interesting about this news this week is that this legislation won't cover sites where it's user-generated adult sites.
So OnlyFans and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then
exactly.
again, you'd have to use your credit card to get into those generally, don't you? So again, you have to be a grown up in the first place, really.
And there is more legislation coming on this. But yeah, I think it's talking about that whole kind of context, that setting, that place, and how you can make those spaces safer. And like you said, it's not the 16, 17-year-olds who have found a way to get around the system necessarily. It's about protecting those younger children who really don't know what it is that they're seeing.
Except, Mariana, that covers, I'm not going to sit here and list off the names of porn sites, people know what they are. That covers the big porn sites people have heard of. But it doesn't cover the sites that we all use every day that you don't necessarily think of as adult sites, but have adult material on them, like Google. Children can find pornographic images by searching on Google Images with Safe Search Off. There's porn all over X and Instagram. So it's bigger than just, regulating porn sites, isn't it?
Yes, and I think some of the issues with the regulation or the debate around regulation have been when to expand it to other platforms such as social media. So the problem with the regulation or the backlash against it is the lack of clarity. Some of them are talking about whether you can start regulating that the only websites that need to be regulated are the ones where their content is over 33% porn. And so how do you decide that? Is that the amount of pixels, the length of a video? It just opens this Pandora box, which I think is really important to open so that we can have this conversation. Just as you were talking about the credit card issue with the question with OnlyFans, it just shows that people who are willing to pay for the porn are already quite comfortable with having their details taken. It's more an issue with the freely accessible porn, which is actually what overlaps with the children that are at risk, because if it's paid for, then it's already behind the paywall, it's already sort of protected. So that does beg the question to those bigger websites.
Yes, and with those sites that make the porn freely available, Leaf, as you were indicating in one of your earlier answers, they're not necessarily the most trustworthy companies as it is. They're companies where they probably don't own the rights to all the material they're allowing you to access. They ask a few questions about who's uploading what, but it might not be your body that you're choosing to share anyway. There should be more regulation around all of that, shouldn't there?
Yeah.
quite mature in our relationship with these platforms now. They've been going for over 10 years.
I mean, I think if you ask me too many questions about this, you'll get to some quite scarily sort of dictatorship style answers, which is basically that I hate porn, that I think porn should be banned for basically all adults as well as all children, especially. But you know, I mean, that's just my own personal position on porn, which is that I think it's doing immense damage to our society. Yeah, I mean, of all the companies, you wouldn't exactly want the porn websites to have your details. Also, porn websites have already been in trouble for having stuff on their platform that is, you know, illegal. So women being filmed having sex without knowing that they're being filmed, and all sorts of other stuff. There's also a story that stayed with me from university, was a friend of a friend who, you know, started watching normal porn and then it got progressively more violent, and it seemed that he was being served up more and more violent porn, and then eventually the sex that he was having with his girlfriend was just sort of not, it wasn't vivid enough because he'd been so sort of pickled by online porn, and so he wasn't underage, but he was, I guess 20 or something, and so the issues with porn do extend beyond just the sort of 18 cutoff, although that's much harder to legislate and would probably have a much bigger kickback within sort of society. So,
well, Julia, regardless of Leaf's personal prejudices when it comes to porn, it is with us. There is an attempt by the government to regulate around it. Do you think it's going to work? I mean, a lot of people just say, well, whatever you do, it can't work because there'll always be a way around it. Or do you think maybe the Online Safety Act will bring some solution?
Yeah, I really hope so. And in the States, there's been quite a lot of success with this. A number of states in America have introduced similar rules and regulations, and already they're seeing like great success with it. So I would really hope that something similar could happen here.
Okay. Julia, you're finishing the show and you're up next after this. Julia, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
There's a new meaning to the phrase work smarter, not harder.
Remote work? Well, it's kind of like the golden ticket for handling multiple job commitments. People can juggle tasks and responsibilities all while chilling in their PJs at home. Thanks to digital tools, communication apps, and project management software, people can really rock multiple jobs without breaking a sweat. And you know what? The whole pandemic situation just turbocharged this trend even further, making it not just okay, but kind of cool for people to be pulling double duty.
YouTuber recruiter Preston on Friday last week in his video WTF is overemployment. Julia, WTF is overemployment.
So overemployment is when someone has more than one job, and typically it's referring to remote workers who are able to have these multiple jobs and juggle them at home without their employers knowing, typically.
Okay, and
so
that's been around for a while as a trend, actually. So what's happened this week?
So Business Insider has done a really interesting deep dive onto the reality of how this plays out for a worker. So they interviewed a 48-year-old network engineer in Texas who at one point had 3 jobs that he was juggling with a combined salary of $344,000 a year. Unbelievable. But it was not what I was expecting, because I'd seen, like you were saying, this trend has been around for a while, and I've seen a lot about how it's like a surefire way to burn out and it's completely unsustainable, which I'm sure those things are true. However, he was saying that in the current economic climate, actually, it has really helped him in terms of job security. So this particular worker had one job that made him redundant, and then several months later was made redundant from another. And he was saying that actually, compared to the situation that his co-workers were left in, he was in a position of pretty good job security because he still had his other job that he'd been doing. He could spend more time dedicated to that and improve his performance. But also in the meantime, he'd managed to pay off his mortgage, save up for his kids to go to college, and also save up for retirement. So it really stood out to me as just this kind of alternate spin on something that I think has been kind of seen as this really negative thing. But actually, there really are great benefits.
I mean, you can understand as the person who's just been made unemployed from one of your jobs, Mariana, that you might want to have another one in your back pocket. But from the point of view of an employer, this is horrific, isn't it? This concept that the people you're paying that kind of money as well, $100,000 a year to work from home, might be doing the same for another employer or another two employers at the same time as they're remote working for you.
It sounds almost like the usual concerns in a romantic relationship, whether your partner is cheating on you, and you have no way to prove because you only see them through a screen now. So it's like almost long distance dating all of a sudden. But I think so. What are the manager's priorities? Are they that you are performing, you are a high performer, and they are delivering on your goals? In which case, if you are, then how is the manager going to know? What does the manager stand to lose from that? If this person in the case that Julie was talking about was able to do this successfully, then there is a reason that they were able to do it successfully. And I'm assuming that there was no dip in productivity. Also because some of the consequences that they mentioned is that they were at severe risk of burning out and they found it long-term unsustainable. So I sort of feel like this would be something that you do as a one-off, more so than you just commit to this lifestyle for decades on end. I just can't imagine. But it also begs the question as to whether you actually need a 9 to 5 or those 40 hours per week to get your work done, because naturally there are points in the day that they have more or less of a workload, and it just shows. Actually, I think the managers should be, in a way, ironically proud that their employees have such good time management skills that they're able to do 3 full-time jobs at once.
I suppose, some employers would be proud of employees who did a voluntary job alongside their day job, right, Leaf? If you were a voluntary firefighter as well as working at the Week magazine, they'd probably enjoy that.
Well,
if you've got extra time and you choose to work for someone else, maybe that's up to you.
I don't know. I think that businesses, in my experience, are pretty uninterested in their employees' private lives. My colleagues might like to hear fun stories about me saving children from burning buildings, but I don't actually think that their attitude would stay positive if it was in any way impeding on my work for the week. As it happens, I work 4 days of the week, but I also have 2 kind of projects outside of the week. So I'm built to be quite pro.
Are you overemployed?
Workers. I think so, yeah. But but my bosses know about this, and I basically write freelance on the side, and also am just trying to finish a book. So I think that it's good to stay busy. If you have the energy and capacity to work lots, then especially when you're young, and especially if your salary isn't massive, I find it very hard to think why you shouldn't.
A side hustle is nothing new, is it, Julia? And particularly in sort of vaguely creative fields like writing. Certainly in things like acting, it's quite common, isn't it, that someone's a waiter during the week and then they go off to auditions. But we're talking about 9 to 5 day jobs here on full-time salaries. We're talking about people who would be PAYE in the UK, having 2 or 3 employers. How much of it do you think is actually going on?
That is a good question. More than I think people realise. I feel like it's probably more of an American thing as well, at least from the articles that I had seen. But there is an overemployment Discord and WhatsApp channel that has more than 300,000 people on it. Wow. And also someone has set up a website called overemployed.com, which has quite a good following that shares tips and tricks for how to do this. I also saw some census-wide research that found last year that 16% of UK employees were considering taking a second job due to finances. Now, whether that's a side hustle or additional hours or not wasn't specified. But McKinsey also published some research in September that said 5% of the workforce were double dipping or poly workers, also quite fun words for describing this. So I'd say it is probably a minority of workers, but also probably more than we think.
But also probably the people who are quite well paid in the first place, Mariana. If you've got a remote working job that's based around technology, it's not the same as a cleaner, say, who has to be in the place they're supposed to be to do the job and can't be somewhere else at the same time.
Yeah, there's this idea that it's almost expected that if you are at sort of the bottom levels of the labor market, you will have 2 jobs to be able to afford the things that one full-time job in IT at the very top will provide. So I suppose there's this moral idea about the fact that you are deceiving the contractual obligations that you have to dedicate these 40 hours a week to this company, whether you're just creating email templates because there's nothing else to do. And I think one of the articles sort of suggests this shows that the people who are in overemployment are actually managing different clients, and then maybe they should just consider a career change into freelancing, for instance.
Yes.
But that is so much more precarious in terms of the job security that you have. And I think that the story that Julie was talking about highlights that there isn't much that the managers can do, because if you have 3 full-time jobs, if one of them finds out that you're doing this, then great, you lose one, you keep two. And so there isn't really, and if you're able to do it and you don't burn out, I really don't see what the incentive is to stop going for that financial stability or living debt free, which is also a product of the cost of living crisis and all these other things that we have, which I agree with you, Olly. I don't think it's something that people in the IT field in the Silicon Valley are actually feeling as much as other groups.
It's so interesting because it kind of dovetails with so many buzzwords that we've talked about before, doesn't it, Leaf? I mean, the kind of retiring early phenomenon that you were talking about before, you know, it's maybe not a surprise there's lots of people under 30 thinking about this. But also, I suppose, the kind of bullshit jobs thing.
Yeah.
You know, there's a sense that you could only do this if one of your jobs was already overpaying you for something that wasn't that difficult. Because if there were two really hard jobs, it wouldn't be possible.
Yes, and certainly, you know, you'd be in trouble if you were double dipping or polyworking and you had clashing calls on the same day or two, you know, conferences that you'd have to sort of send a sort of ambassador to the second conference. I think for me, it's also a story of the kind of the problems in the labor market, which is that there are some highly prized workers, say IT workers, people who have coding skills or like, you know, financial know-how, all those people with very marketable skills that are so in demand that they can, you know, like take on lots of jobs. And then there are other people that don't have the skills that are putting them in demand. And so they're having to take on jobs for a completely different reason, which is basically just to, you know, pay their rising rent and pay for their rising food costs. So it's both a kind of exciting story for, you know, for the lucky workers that are so popular that they get to, you know, charge employers twice. But it's also quite sad that there are all these people that would love to have two really high paid jobs, but you know, don't have the skills for that.
If I had to give you an extra day's pay, Julia, and you could do anything but not your full-time job, what would it be?
Is it really bad that my initial reaction was go to the pub?
I don't think that's a job. I suppose food and drink critic.
Oh, it's a job.
Yeah.
Yeah, food and drink. I do a little bit of that with the week. If as a job, I would love to be a professional musician, but I would need to work on my skills for that.
Yeah.
So.
It's not clear how you get paid for that either with 1 day a week. Mariana, what would you do if you had an extra day for a second job?
I love this question because just the other day I was talking to a friend and wondering if we had to join the gig economy, which skills do we have between the two of us that would allow us to not work a 9 to 5? And my conclusion was that as an editor, I could always do freelance. But the only other thing I could think about is that I do these body combat gym classes as my activity. And because it's the only thing I do and I wear glasses, I can't wear them in the class. So I always go front row. So after 4 years, I've gotten quite good at it. And the instructor has asked me if I would like to train to be an instructor as well. And I thought, this actually works with my 9 to 5. I would remain, remain an honest employer because this would be from 6, 7 p.m. onwards and no one would stop me.
I love that your visual impairment has led you on to physical strength.
The sheer pressure of being on the front row at these classes with like punches and kicks going everywhere, yes.
And Leaf, you've already said you're a master of disguise, but if you had to add an extra string to your bow?
I think maybe like a sort of chocolate sampler in like Cadbury's or something really, really fun, or like a wine taster.
I think all of you would be really bad at overemployment because it's got to be something really dull, hasn't it? Like, you know, recruitment analytics for you to be able to pull this off. But anyway, you go off to your professional musicianship and personal training and chocolate tasting. That's it for another edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Leaf, Mariana and Julia. You can follow this show for free and listen during your second job. Get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.